Well, thanks very much, John, and thanks to K&L Gates and KPMG and indeed for welcoming us and putting this on today. RAND has been in Pittsburgh for 19 years, and we really feel very much part of this community. It's a very, very popular office within RAND for our staff, and they very much feel that they are in the best of all of our offices, and given the fact that one of the other ones is by the beach in Santa Monica, that's pretty good. So last week, the Daily Telegraph reported that the British government had banned April Fool's jokes because in the current state of the Brexit process, no one could tell what a joke was. But it's, of course, an April Fool's joke, but only really just. And in the lead of the article on page 1 last week, the New York Times referred to Brexit's long-running theater of the absurd. I actually think that's a little unfair to Samuel Beckett, who had a firmer grasp on his plot. What we've learned so far from Brexit, what's likely to happen, and what it will mean for business in the U.S. more broadly, that's what I'm going to try and tackle. And I look very much forward to the comments of Piers and Chris, and hopefully together and with all of your contributions, we can sort this all out. Now, I appreciate that you've probably been following the dramatic events in the British Parliament and the European Council, and I can assure you that nothing similar has ever taken place in history. Today could have been, as you mentioned, John, extra special as the day that Brexit formally occurred, but in the latest plot twist 2 days ago, the European Council gave Britain a flextension, another a neologism that has resulted from this process, allowing it to remain a member state of the EU for 6.5 months until Halloween, unless it approves the withdrawal agreement before then. So to inform the subsequent discussion, I thought I would give everyone a reduced Shakespeare quick history of the US, the UK, and the EU and the various terms that have been bandied about for post-Brexit trade relations. I promise it'll be worth it later. We sometimes forget that the European Economic Community, later renamed the European Union, is a direct result of one of the far-sighted acts of American diplomacy, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan required the Europeans to cooperate economically in order to qualify for U.S. economic assistance for the war-ravaged continent. The shared experience in rebuilding Europe's coal, steel, and industrial capacity led Europeans to the idea of creating the European Economic Community. And when the Treaty of Rome that created the EEC in 1957, Britain chose not to join. In the 1960s, it changed its mind, affected by the faster economic growth on the continent than Britain was experiencing, but Charles de Gaulle repeatedly vetoed the British application. Britain was able to join in 1973 along with Ireland and Denmark, but second thoughts emerged quickly, and they had their first referendum in 1975 because the leftists, the Socialist Left Labour Party at the time, wanted out. But the referendum result was to stay in because of the strong support of the Tory party. Including by Margaret Thatcher. But over the years since, the British Euroscepticism has grown, especially in the Tory party, egged on by Margaret Thatcher's objections to budget formulas, perceived loss of power to Brussels, and a lot of wildly exaggerated scare stories about EU regulations in the British tabloid press. And more recently, anxieties about migration and economic inequality. So to cope with the corrosive Tory party divisions on the subject, in 2013, then Prime Minister David Cameron proposed that if the Tories won the next election, the UK would renegotiate aspects of the UK's relationship to Brussels and put the results to another referendum on whether to stay in. People quickly forgot about the details of the renegotiation and focused on the referendum. That was the basis for the referendum held June 23, 2016, and it was settled by a margin of 52 to 48% in favor of leave. Cameron then resigned. Theresa May took over as prime minister with a mandate to make Brexit happen. That's the reduced Shakespeare version. Now, a couple of key terms to explain. Free movement of peoples is guaranteed by the EU treaties. It means that any EU citizen can freely live and work in any other EU member state. It is one of the 4 freedoms in the treaty, the others being free movement of goods, capital, and services. Article 50 of the treaty sets the terms for any departures, and it's actually a recent addition. These are very unfavorable to the leaving country and by design. Once it gives notice, the leaver is out in 2 years, unless all the other European Union countries agree to an extension. This is the first go for the Article 50 process, the British leaving, and in using it, the EU has also insisted, although this isn't really quite so clear in the treaty, that Britain agree first to the terms of its departure before it gets to discuss its future trading relationship. The EU also insisted that the UK agree to a hefty financial settlement and the famous backstop to ensure that there would be no border checks in Ireland before they get to talk about trade arrangements. More on this, of course, later. The European Union is a customs union, which means that it applies a common external tariff to all goods entering the EU from abroad, with no tariffs between its members. But until the 1960s, it still had border checks. Until the 1980s, it still had border checks to deal with differences in regulations. At that time, in the 1980s, as part of the EC 92 initiative, the EU undertook to pass over 250 separate laws to put in place a single market to eliminate those border checks on goods. The EU today has a customs union with Turkey, but there are border checks on trade between Turkey and the EU, and they have deals with Norway and Switzerland that allow them to participate in the single market. Both pay into the EU budget for the privilege, and Norway grants free movement for EU citizens to live and work in the EU. Another key trade term to define: the EU has free trade agreements with a number of countries, most notably Canada and Korea, and is discussing one with Japan. In FTAs, participants eliminate, in theory, all tariffs between them, but they can continue quotas and other barriers and often maintain different regulatory systems. They have border checks too. The NAFTA, for example, is an FTA, as are our agreements, U.S. agreements with Korea, Australia, and other countries. Now, if Brexit happens and the EU doesn't enter into a customs union with the EU, the UK and the US have discussed putting in place an FTA between us. But there would be many difficult issues, politically difficult issues to work out, not the least of which have to do with agriculture. If Britain ends up in a post-Brexit customs union with the EU, it would not be able to agree to an FTA with the US or any other partner unless the EU did it as well. Now, Britain formally notified the EU that it wanted to withdraw March 29, 2017. That set in motion the two-year clock that would have led to March 29, 2019. And in the 2 years since, the withdrawal agreement, the terms of departure, and the backstop, along with general non-binding political declaration on future relations and a transition agreement have been worked out, collectively called Theresa May's deal. That's what failed to gain a majority 3 times in Parliament. So last week, up against the wall of the crash out, Prime Minister May, trying to demonstrate some forward movement, invited opposition leader Corbyn to see if they could work on a common proposal that would impress the Europeans, or to agree between themselves to accept a parliamentary vote on something that would gain a majority. Haven't agreed, but the EU, in the end, had to face the question of whether to support an extension anyway. So what have we learned from this process thus far? I think the first point to make is that leavers really didn't expect to win the 2016 referendum. This now seems to be a commonplace observation, but it has had fundamental and continuing implications for the course of the negotiations and the consequent political future for Britain. Since they didn't expect to win, and they didn't have the support of the government's policy apparatus, Brexit advocates never resolved the basic contradictions in their argument for leaving. When the May government swung around to making Brexit mean Brexit, these contradictions weren't tackled first. Leavers had these two contradictory impulses. On the one hand, anti-immigration, nativist, anti-globalization arguments, similar to those in the US in the last election. And the other, a Singapore of the Atlantic vision that Britain, freed of the EU's trade policy, could do much better in international competition. For the first group, Leavers insisted on exiting the single market and stopping free movement, making a Switzerland or Norway solution untenable. And for the second, trade policy independence was supreme, which ruled out a customs union and immediately put at risk the Good Friday solution in Northern Ireland. If Leavers were all on one side or the other, or had thought through the issues before the referendum, it all would have gone much more smoothly. And of course, the bread and circuses, EU mockery, fake news strands of the Leave movement, epitomized by Boris Johnson, made serious policy discussions that much tougher. Second, and as a result, the negotiations process was messy. Some have called it shambolic on the British side. Theresa May decided at the outset that she had to keep Tory Leavers on side for the sake of party unity. That drove the early Article 50 filing in March 2017, before they really knew what they wanted, and also threw away much of British leverage with the rest of the EU. There is no evidence that in that first year, 2016-2017, the British government understood what a problem Ireland would be. There was rapid turnover in key ministers covering Brexit, and Britain never established an early and cooperative problem-solving approach with Dublin, even though it should have been clear that they would need one. The British did briefly try with the Irish, but the Dublin cannily put its chips on Brussels to serve its interests. Now, Britain had a strong cadre of Europeanists and a tradition of success in working in Brussels, yet May made no use of her retired mandarins and forced out its ambassador to the EU, Ivan Rogers, when he made inconvenient, though accurate, observations. So the UK was at a disadvantage in the field from the start, even though they had all-stars on the bench. Third, and by contrast, the EU's management of the Brexit process was exceptionally good. The selection of Michel Barnier as the lead negotiator was inspired. He had experience as a commissioner, deep understanding of Brussels, and an instinct for managing the member states. He recognized right away that the EU 27's biggest challenge would be staying unified, given its wide range of interests. He imposed the no dialogue until you file Article 50 notice rule right away, even though it didn't really have a treaty basis, and insisted on settlement of withdrawal terms before any discussion of future relations. The EU was so conflicted and disorganized and May was so under pressure from the hardcore Leavers, she didn't even fight those early battles. We did a recent study on Brexit called After Brexit, and that study had a game theory chapter, and the way we put it was that the EU knew from the outset it was playing a zero-sum game where it could only win if Britain lost. Britain, on the other hand, wasn't sure what game it was playing and against whom. Fourth, Theresa May's political judgments and instincts were poor, which aggravated the UK's difficulties. The decision to call a snap election in the summer of 2017 to improve her parliamentary majority after denying any such intention was the worst decision she made, as it cost the Tories their majority, elevated Jeremy Corbyn in his own eyes and those of the Labour base, and greatly empowered the Ulster Unionist Party, the DUP, which had under a support arrangement, kept the Tories in party. And during the campaign, May was seen as really a wooden campaigner. And by all accounts, she also hasn't been able to make connections with her EU Council, EU Summit counterparts. All of these consequences have gravely weakened May's endgame. And yet, as we've seen in recent months, and as other leaders occasionally when standing on the edge of the abyss, Theresa May is so weak that she's strong. Her withdrawal agreement lost in January by the biggest margin of any bill in recent British parliamentary history, yet she decisively held off a leadership challenge and a vote of no confidence. Corbyn's outside the mainstream leftism and unrelated corrosive anti-Semitism problems in his party have helped May cement the no alternative position. Maggie Thatcher should have been so lucky. Finally, it's now clear to everyone that, as our study demonstrated in 2017, Britain will harm the UK significantly economically and the rest of the EU only somewhat. Banks have moved operations to the continent. Honda and Nissan have announced job cuts, and foreign direct investment has stalled. There are lots of other indicators as well. London property markets have cooled. Airbus is talking about supply chain alternatives. And this is all before a possible no-deal outcome. So what happened this week? I did a TV interview on Wednesday in which I said what was really happening was that the reality show that is Brexit has been renewed for a new season. It got a laugh, but it's really not so funny. The British were unable to muster a majority in Parliament for the withdrawal agreement, or really anything else, except a narrow majority by 3 votes that didn't want a no-deal exit. The outreach that I mentioned earlier to Labour hasn't provided any early solutions. So it fell on the EU summit to provide the exit route on Wednesday night by voting unanimously for a 6-month extension. I like to think of it as a game of chicken in which the EU saved Britain by swerving at the last minute. So what happens now? Well, one thing that will happen is that the British candidates will compete in the European Parliament election starting May 23rd, ostensibly only for a term of 4 months. That is necessary because otherwise the EP, the European Parliament, which takes office on July 1, might be legally questionable. But more importantly, with this new 6-month lease on membership, Prime Minister May will be resuming her effort to get the withdrawal agreement through. And to do that, she will need to attract either harder-line Tories who hate the backstop but may also still want to get Britain out, or Labour who favor a customs union, which is anathema to many Tories precisely because it would prevent Britain from ever negotiating its own trade agreements. Maybe the force of the recent follies or public pressure will allow one or the other side to prevail, but it's not a sure thing. If Britain does, by hook or crook, approve the withdrawal agreement, it will get to leave sooner than October 31, begin a transition period, and start negotiating the long-term trade agreement it will need for the future. So what does all this mean for business? In the short term, by which I mean the next 6 months, little will change. Britain will remain a member of the single market and apply EU's common external tariffs. But the uncertainty about the future has affected foreign investors in Britain. That will continue. Banks and other financial institutions that have been moving operations to other EU member states will likely continue to make such preparations for the day Britain may leave. And domestically in the UK, the political struggle over the form of Britain's post-membership relationship with the EU, which is really of primordial importance to the UK, will continue. It will be important for business to follow that debate. From the standpoint of U.S. business, tariffs and regulatory barriers between the U.S. and the UK are not likely to change very much, whether Britain adopts the EU's customs union approach, a free trade agreement approach, sometimes called Canada Plus, or a Norway single market approach. But a US-UK free trade agreement, which in theory could eliminate barriers between the US and the UK and is strongly supported, at least politically, by President Trump, could possibly improve access for services, including financial services. But it's only possible if the ardent leavers get out of the EU's customs union. Our analysis shows that such an FTA between the US and the UK would have a positive, though not large, impact on the US, and in theory, more significance for the UK. but it would impinge on the problem of open borders in Ireland, so it would be difficult to arrange under most circumstances. There would also be predictable food and other regulatory allergies to such a deal on the part of the British public, from chlorinated chickens to GMOs, so the negotiations wouldn't be easy. These concerns haven't stopped the U.S. Trade Representative's office and the British from preliminary discussions about preparing for such an FTA, but they can only take place for real once the UK is out of the EU. British and American businesses also need to consider the possible economic and other implications of a no-deal crash-out scenario. That scenario has sharp economic consequences for British trade with the EU. And as press accounts have dramatized, in a no-deal scenario, the UK and the EU would be obligated to immediately put in place trade barriers and inspections on trade that now happens seamlessly. British planners have discussed waving through imports from the EU on a transitional basis, relying on manufacturers and wholesalers' declarations. The plans involve cutting duties on agricultural commodities from high EU levels to prevent a food price spike in Britain. Most importantly, in a no-deal scenario, that segment of British manufacturing that depends on just-in-time value chain, parts and components supply back and forth across the channel, would be rendered non-competitive. That is doubtless the reason the Japanese manufacturers in particular have been vocal about freezing their investment and production plans until they see what's happening. Now, our analysis shows that overall, U.S. investors in the UK are more focused on the domestic market than the sort of export platform market. So they're less at risk on that basis. But if the British domestic economy is hit badly by no deal, U.S. firms would suffer that way. And it's conceivable that port congestion and Her Majesty's Customs being overwhelmed by coping with trade with the continent, clearance times for U.S. exports to the UK will be affected as well. The Brexit process is full of irony and unintended consequences. Just three of the most notable to point out. The road to Brexit began with David Cameron promising in 2013 to renegotiate the relationship. He saw this as a way to rid Tory politics of the Eurosceptic cancer. The result has been the opposite, casting Britain out of the EU and tearing the Tory party apart. An irony. For UK leavers, the economics didn't seem to matter, or could be merely assumed away in search of regained sovereignty. They called the Remainers' concerns Project Fear. But leavers have always assumed, or at least argued, that Brussels would give way on all issues because of the EU's supposed economic dependence on the British market. Political concerns, however, have been dominant on both sides of the channel. And the Irish focused early on the preservation of no borders to movement of goods and people on the island. On their behalf, the EU insisted on the unqualified backstop unless the UK agrees to something equivalent, although no one knows quite what that might be. Yet insisting on the backstop without a time limit may well have sunk the withdrawal agreement, leading possibly to a no-deal, chaotic exit, and of course the Irish border situation would be much more acute. So what we've seen this week is only the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end of the Brexit saga. Ahead of us will be years of negotiations, dramatic votes in Parliament and the European Council, and political turmoil, especially in Britain. One reason is that, as I mentioned at the outset, few really thought about this process before it began, and we just really don't know as much about raising trade barriers as we do about cutting them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you for that excellent historical overview and global perspective.